The story begins with darkness, both literal and metaphorical, a quiet house, a cold night, and an oppressive silence that feels almost alive. Anna sat on the edge of her bed, her eyes flicking to her alarm clock as it ticked past 1:47 a.m. Sleep had eluded her for nights now, but tonight was different. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though she was alone in her small apartment. Anna was no stranger to insomnia. The loneliness of her new city amplified the restless nights, but this was something else entirely. It started 2 weeks ago, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, fleeting shadows that moved just out of her line of sight, and a creeping unease that refused to leave her alone. It wasn't until tonight that she finally noticed it. At first it was subtle. She was reading by the soft glow of her bedside lamp when she saw the shape on her wall. A shadow stretched long and thin across the faded wallpaper. It looked out of place, as though it didn't belong in the soft glow of her reading light. Anna frowned and glanced at the objects in her room, trying to identify its source, but everything appeared normal. The shadow didn't match any shape in her room. She shook her head, laughing nervously at her own paranoia. "It's just the lamp playing tricks," she muttered to herself. She moved her head slightly, testing the angle of the light, but the shadow didn't shift the way she expected. It remained stubbornly still. Anna stood and walked toward the wall, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. She leaned in close, inspecting the dark figure. The closer she got, the more unnatural it seemed. Its edges were too sharp, its form too solid. Then she noticed the worst part. The shadow wasn't just on the wall. It was faintly outlined on the floor as well, as though it were cast by someone standing in the middle of her room. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, her heart racing, but the room was empty. She backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Calm down," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing, just a trick of the light." But as she moved back toward her bed, she realized the shadow was no longer where it had been. It had moved. Now, it was stretched across the ceiling, elongated and grotesque, as though it were crawling upward. Her throat tightened as she stared at it, her body frozen with fear. She reached for her phone, the glowing screen a small comfort in the oppressive dark. The words came almost unbidden. How to get rid of a shadow that doesn't belong? Her search yielded nothing useful. Forums filled with superstitious ramblings and stories that mirrored her situation far too closely. Anna's eyes darted back to the ceiling. The shadow hadn't moved again, but its presence felt heavier now, as though it were pressing down on her, suffocating the air around her. Desperate for answers, Anna clicked on a thread titled "The Shadow That Wasn't Mine." The post was chillingly familiar. A user described a mysterious shadow in their home that seemed to move independently of any light source. They claimed it grew bolder with time, appearing in corners, stretching across walls, and looming closer in the dead of night. The final line sent shivers down Anna's spine. "Whatever you do, don't turn your back on it." Anna closed her laptop with shaking hands, her heart pounding. She glanced up at the ceiling. The shadow was gone. For a moment, relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Her breath hitched as she turned her head slowly. The shadow was back, now looming on the wall directly behind her. It was closer than before. Anna bolted for the light switch, her fingers fumbling against the wall. She flipped it on, flooding the room with harsh white light. The shadow was gone. She stood there for several minutes, her chest heaving as she struggled to calm herself. The rational part of her mind screamed that it was all in her head, that exhaustion and stress were playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the light. The shadow was real. That night, Anna slept with every light in her apartment turned on. She didn't care about the electricity bill or the fact that her neighbors might find it odd. She needed the reassurance of brightness, the safety of illumination. But even with the lights blazing, she felt it. The sense of being watched never left her. Her dreams were restless and fragmented, filled with shifting darkness and faint whispers that tugged at the edges of her consciousness. When she finally woke, it was to the sound of her alarm blaring. The sun was streaming through the windows, bathing her room in light. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe it had all been a nightmare. But then she saw it. The shadow was back. It clung to the far corner of the room, darker than the shadows cast by the morning light. Anna's blood ran cold. The sun was shining, the room was bright, and yet there it was, impossible, wrong, and terrifyingly real. Determined not to let the fear consume her, Anna spent the day researching. She combed through forums, read obscure articles, and even ventured into online chat rooms dedicated to paranormal phenomena. Most of what she found was useless, wild theories and cryptic warnings that offered no real solutions. One post, however, stood out. It was from a user named Shadowhunter. The post was terse but direct. If you're seeing a shadow that isn't yours, it means it's chosen you. Whatever you do, don't ignore it. Don't turn your back on it. And whatever happens, don't let it touch you. Anna's stomach churned as she read the post over and over, the words sinking in like lead. Don't let it touch you. She glanced back at the corner of her room, where the shadow lingered. It hadn't moved all day, but its presence felt heavier, more oppressive. She couldn't ignore it any longer. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Anna's anxiety grew. The shadow remained in its corner, unmoving but undeniably there. She turned on every light in the apartment, determined to banish the darkness. But as the hours passed, she realized the lights did nothing to deter it. The shadow seemed unaffected, as though it existed outside the rules of reality. By midnight, the tension was unbearable. Anna sat on her bed, clutching her phone like a lifeline, her eyes darting between the shadow and the glow of her screen. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Her heart leapt into her throat as the bulbs dimmed, plunging the room into a dull, wavering glow. And in that moment, she saw it. The shadow moved. It didn't slither or creep like she expected. It walked, its form twisted and humanoid. It stepped forward, its movements deliberate and unervingly smooth. Anna's hands shook as she gripped the edge of her bed. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The shadow stopped at the foot of her bed, its form looming and oppressive. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have noticed me." Anna's breath caught in her throat as the words echoed through the room. The voice wasn't loud, yet it carried a weight that made it feel like it pressed against her very soul. It wasn't quite human, deep, cold, and laced with an unsettling resonance, as though it were coming from a place beyond the walls of her room. Her body remained frozen, paralyzed by a fear that gripped her more tightly with each passing second. What? What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't move, but its form seemed to pulse, growing darker and more defined with each passing moment. Its edges sharpened, its presence becoming more tangible, almost like it was forcing its way into her world. "You saw me," it said, the voice sliding into her ears like a dagger. "That was your mistake." Anna's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How was this possible? Shadows didn't talk, they didn't move. This couldn't be real. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firmer now. "Why are you in my room?" The shadow tilted its head in a disturbingly human gesture, though its form remained an inky void. "I am the space between," it said cryptically. "I exist in the cracks of your world, where the light falters and your mind refuses to look. And now, I exist here." Anna's chest tightened, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. "Why me? I didn't do anything." The shadow took a step closer, its form shifting and twisting with every movement. "You noticed," it replied simply. "And once you notice us, we notice you." Panic bubbled in Anna's chest. She needed to do something, anything, to get out of this nightmare. Her eyes darted to her phone, which was still clutched in her trembling hand. Maybe she could call someone, anyone, but who would believe her? Her thumb hovered over the screen, but before she could act, the shadow hissed, "Don't." Her phone screen went black. The glow snuffed out, as though an invisible hand had crushed it. Anna's panic turned to terror. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice cracking. The shadow didn't answer immediately. Instead, it moved closer still, the air around it growing colder. Anna could feel the chill sinking into her skin the oppressive weight of its presence threatening to suffocate her. It finally stopped, mere feet from her, and leaned forward, its featureless face level with hers. "To take what is mine," it said. Anna flinched, her mind racing. She needed to get out of the room, but every instinct screamed at her not to turn her back on the thing. Slowly, she began to edge toward the door, her movements cautious and deliberate. The shadow didn't follow, but its presence grew heavier, its oppressive aura making it feel as though the walls were closing in. "Running won't save you," it said, its voice seeming to come from every corner of the room. Ignoring it, Anna reached the door and flung it open, stumbling into the hallway. She didn't stop to look back, sprinting down the corridor and out into the night. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between herself and that thing. Anna didn't stop running until she reached the corner of the block. She collapsed onto a bench, her lungs burning and her legs trembling. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was safe. But then she noticed the streetlights. Their glow seemed dimmer, their light faltering as though something was draining them. She glanced down at the sidewalk and saw it. Her shadow stretched long and thin in the pale light. And next to it was another. Anna's stomach lurched. The second shadow didn't belong to anything. It stood there, unnaturally still, its shape distorted and wrong. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty street. The second shadow didn't respond. It simply shifted, sliding closer to her like an oil spill creeping across the ground. Desperate, Anna bolted down the street, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to keep moving. She turned a corner and nearly collided with an old man walking a dog. "Whoa, slow down there," he said, startled. Anna grabbed his arm, her eyes wild. "You have to help me," she pleaded. "There's something following me." The man frowned, his expression skeptical. "Following you? What are you talking about?" Before Anna could explain, the dog began to growl, its ears flattening against its head. It barked furiously, its gaze fixed on something behind her. Anna turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The shadow was there, standing at the edge of the streetlight's glow. The old man's face paled, his grip tightening on the dog's leash. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The shadow didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its form darker and more defined than ever. "You see it too?" Anna asked, her voice shaking. The man nodded, his face etched with fear. "I don't know what it is, but you need to get away from it. Now!" Anna didn't need to be told twice. She took off running again, the old man's warnings fading into the background. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a plan, but nothing made sense. How do you fight something that isn't supposed to exist? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and far too close. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. The shadow wasn't just following her now. It was walking in her direction, its movements unnaturally smooth and deliberate. Anna's chest tightened as she stumbled into an alleyway, her back pressing against the cold brick wall. She was trapped. The shadow stopped at the mouth of the alley, its form towering and grotesque. For the first time, Anna noticed something new. Its edges were fraying, tendrils of darkness curling and writhing like smoke. "You can't escape me," it said, its voice a low growl that reverberated through the narrow space. Anna's eyes darted around, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her gaze landed on a broken pipe lying on the ground. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She grabbed it and held it out in front of her, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice filled with a mix of fear and defiance. The shadow didn't stop. It moved closer, its form shifting and pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Anna swung the pipe, her movements frantic and desperate. The metal passed through the shadow without resistance, as though it were striking smoke. The shadow didn't flinch. If anything, it seemed amused. "You can't fight me," it said, its voice cold and final. "I am part of you now." Anna's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you doing this to me?" she sobbed. The shadow loomed over her, its form consuming the light around it. "Because you saw me," it said simply. "And now, you belong to the dark." Before Anna could respond, the shadow lunged. The world went black. Anna awoke to silence and darkness, so thick it felt alive. Her body ached as if she'd been crushed beneath a heavy weight. The air was damp and cold, carrying a metallic tang that stung her nostrils. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt sluggish, as though submerged in water. When her vision adjusted, she realized she was no longer in the alley. Instead, she was in a vast, shadowed expanse, a place where the edges of the world seemed to dissolve into blackness. The ground beneath her felt strange, not quite solid but not soft either, as if it were made of dense, compacted ash. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her question was met with a low, echoing laugh. It came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding her like a suffocating shroud. "You've crossed over," the voice said, cold and mocking. Anna struggled to her feet, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Crossed over? To where? The darkness around her seemed to shift, shadows curling and twisting like serpents. "To my domain," the voice replied. "This is the place where forgotten things dwell. The cracks between your reality and mine." Anna's stomach churned as she took in her surroundings. The ground stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional jagged silhouette of what looked like dead trees or twisted structures. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though it were pressing against her chest. "I didn't want this," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "You noticed me," the voice replied, its tone unwavering. "That was enough to draw you here." Tears burned Anna's eyes. "Why me? What did I do to deserve this?" A shape began to materialize before her, coalescing from the swirling shadows. It was the same figure that had haunted her room, tall, humanoid, and impossibly dark. But here, in this place, it was more defined. Its edges no longer blurred. Its presence felt even more oppressive. The figure tilted its head, regarding her with something akin to curiosity. "You humans are so quick to ask why, as if the universe owes you an explanation," it said. "But there is no reason, no purpose. You saw me. You acknowledged me. That is all it takes." Anna clenched her fists, her fear giving way to a flicker of anger. "Then send me back. I don't belong here." The figure laughed again, the sound reverberating through the dark expanse. "Oh, but you do. You crossed into my world, and now you are part of it." Anna's mind raced. If this thing had brought her here, maybe it could send her back. She needed to find a way to reason with it, or trick it. "What do you want from me?" she asked, forcing herself to meet its gaze, though its face was nothing more than a void. The shadow figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "To exist in your world is to feed," it said. "To linger in yours is to grow stronger. But your world does not welcome us. It burns, it resists. To remain there, I need an anchor, a vessel." Anna's blood ran cold. "You're trying to possess me," she realized, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't deny it. "You're cleverer than most," it said, almost amused. "But cleverness won't save you." A surge of determination coursed through Anna. She wasn't going to let this thing win. She took a step back, her hands clenching into fists. "You said I noticed you, that I pulled you into my world. Fine, then I'll make sure you never get back." The shadow's form flickered, as if momentarily caught off guard. "Bold words," it said, "but you don't understand the rules of this place. You are in my domain now. There is no escape." But Anna wasn't listening. She remembered the forums she'd read, the warnings and cryptic messages. The shadow was powerful, yes, but it also seemed bound by certain rules, ones it hadn't fully explained. "You don't belong in my world," she said, her voice steadying. "You said it yourself. So if I stay here, if I don't let you take me back, then what?" The shadow hesitated, and for the first time, Anna saw something flicker in its form, an instability, a crack in its otherwise impenetrable demeanor. "You wouldn't dare," it said, its voice losing some of its edge. Anna took another step back, her mind racing. This place was horrible, yes, but if it meant keeping the shadow from crossing over in her world, maybe it was worth the sacrifice. "You need me," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But I don't need you. If I stay here, you'll be trapped. Just like me." The shadow's form twisted violently, its edges rippling like a storm. "You think you can win by sacrificing yourself? Foolish girl. This place will break you, consume you. You won't last a day." "Maybe not," Anna said, "but if it means stopping you, I'll do it." The shadow let out a guttural growl, its form growing larger and more imposing. "You don't understand what you're doing," it hissed. "You're meddling with forces beyond your comprehension." Anna ignored its warnings and began walking away, her steps unsteady but resolute. The vast, shadowy expanse stretched endlessly before her, but she didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between herself and the entity. Behind her, the shadow figure roared, its voice echoing like thunder. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew colder, heavier. "You cannot escape me," it bellowed. "You are already mine." But Anna kept moving, her jaw set in determination. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a glimmer of control, a spark of hope. She didn't know how long she walked, but eventually, the oppressive weight of the shadow's presence began to fade. The air grew lighter, the darkness less suffocating. And then she saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. Anna's heart leapt. She didn't know what the light was or where it led, but it was the only sign of anything other than darkness in this forsaken place. She broke into a run, her feet pounding against the ashen ground. The light grew brighter as she approached, illuminating a small, circular clearing. In the center stood a mirror, tall, ornate, and glowing faintly. Anna skidded to a stop, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The mirror's surface shimmered like liquid, and she could see her reflection staring back at her. Her reflection wasn't moving. The sight sent a chill down Anna's spine. She approached cautiously, her eyes locked on the mirror. Her reflection mirrored her every move, but something about it felt wrong. As she reached out to touch the glass, a voice rang out behind her. "Don't!" She spun around to see the shadow figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was smaller now, its form less defined, but its presence was still as menacing as ever. "That mirror is a trap," it said, its voice dripping with venom. "It will not take you home. It will destroy you." Anna hesitated, her hand hovering inches from the glass. "Why should I believe you?" she demanded. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it took a step closer, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Because you're mine," it said, "and I won't let this place take you from me." Anna turned back to the mirror, her mind racing. Was the shadow telling the truth? Or was this another one of its games? The light from the mirror was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the shadow's world. She had to make a choice. Anna stood frozen between the glowing mirror and the shadow figure, her mind spinning with uncertainty. The mirror's light was warm, a beacon in the desolate darkness. But the shadow's words lingered, heavy with warning. She glanced back at the shadow, whose form now appeared unstable, its edges fraying and dissolving into the surrounding void. For a moment, she thought she saw something within it, fragments of faces, twisted and anguished, reaching out and then vanishing back into the darkness. "Why would you care if the mirror destroys me?" she demanded, her voice cracking with tension. The shadow didn't answer immediately. Its form seemed to ripple, as though struggling to maintain its shape. "You are mine," it said finally, its voice low and strained. "If you go into the mirror, you will cease to exist. Not here, not in your world. Nowhere." Anna swallowed hard. She wanted to believe it was lying, but something in its tone made her hesitate. "What's the catch?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "If I step away from the mirror, what happens? You take me back and make me your, what? Host? Puppet?" The shadow moved closer, though its form flickered weakly with each step. "You are clever, but you do not understand," it said. This place is not meant for you. It will unravel you. Your mind, your body, everything you are will dissolve into the dark, and I will no longer exist." Anna frowned, trying to piece together the fragments of truth buried in the shadow's words. "So you need me to stay intact," she said slowly, her voice gaining confidence. "Without me, you're nothing." The shadow didn't deny it. "You gave me form," it said. "Acknowledge me, and I thrive. Deny me, and I fade. But if you step into that mirror, you will take both of us into oblivion." Anna's hand hovered over the mirror's surface. Its glow pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat. Was this her way out? Or was it the final trap in this horrifying game? Her mind raced back to everything that had happened. The strange warnings, the growing darkness in her room, the suffocating fear that had followed her at every turn. If the shadow needed her to survive, then she held the power. "You said I noticed you," she said, her voice steadying. "That's what started all of this. But what if I stopped noticing you? What if I refused to acknowledge you?" The shadow recoiled slightly, its form rippling violently. "You cannot ignore what you've seen," it hissed. "Once you know we exist, we are always there." Anna took a step forward, her hand still poised over the mirror. "You're lying," she said, her voice growing stronger. "If I take away your anchor, if I step into this mirror or find a way to deny you, you're done. That's why you're trying to stop me." The shadow let out a guttural growl, its form convulsing. "Foolish girl," it spat. "You think you can outsmart me? You are nothing here. You are mine." The shadows around the clearing began to stir, curling inward like a rising tide. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on Anna like an invisible weight. But Anna refused to back down. She pressed her hand against the mirror's surface. It was warm, almost comforting, and as she touched it, she felt a faint pull, gentle but insistent. The shadow screamed, a sound that seemed to shake the very fabric of the dark world. "You will regret this," it bellowed. The ground beneath her feet trembled, cracks spidering out from where she stood. The shadows surged forward, their tendrils lashing out like whips, but they stopped just short of the mirror's glow, recoiling as though burned. "You can't stop me," Anna said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. The pull of the mirror grew stronger, and Anna felt herself being drawn toward its surface. She glanced back at the shadow one last time. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its form now barely holding together. "Do you have a name?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself. The shadow hesitated, its flickering form pausing for a moment. "Names are for your kind," it said. "We are the nameless, the forgotten." Anna nodded, a strange sense of pity welling up in her chest. But she couldn't let it distract her. Without another word, she stepped into the mirror. The sensation was unlike anything Anna had ever experienced. It was as though she were falling and floating at the same time, her body weightless and her mind untethered. Light and darkness swirled around her, pulling her in every direction. And then, with a sudden jolt, she landed. Anna gasped, her lungs burning as though she had been underwater. She opened her eyes and found herself back in her bedroom. The familiar glow of her bedside lamp bathed the room in a soft, warm light. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. Everything looked normal. The shadows were gone, the oppressive weight lifted. But something felt off. Anna walked to the mirror on her wall, her reflection staring back at her. It moved when she moved, smiled when she smiled. But her chest tightened as she noticed something in its eyes, something unfamiliar. She leaned closer, studying her reflection. The longer she looked, the more certain she became that something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't just a reflection. It was watching her. Anna stepped back, her breath quickening. The room seemed to darken around her, the light from the lamp dimming. She turned away from the mirror, but the unease didn't fade. And then she heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "Don't turn around." The whisper echoed in Anna's ears, chilling her to the bone. She stood frozen in the center of her room, afraid to move, let alone breathe. The voice was faint yet unervingly familiar, as though it had come not from behind her, but from within her own mind. "Don't turn around," it repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. Anna's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to look, to confront whatever it was. But the weight of the warning held her still. The shadows in her room didn't seem right. They stretched too long, pooling in unnatural corners, as though the light had grown afraid to touch them. She swallowed hard. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. No answer came. The room remained deathly silent, save for the faint hum of the lamp. Anna's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She couldn't live like this, haunted, afraid of her own home, her own reflection. She'd fought too hard to let this thing win. Slowly, she turned her head, her heart pounding like a drum. But there was nothing there, just her room. The same bed, the same dresser, the same mirror hanging on the wall. Her chest heaved with relief. And then she saw it. The shadow in the mirror wasn't hers. Anna's knees nearly gave out as she stumbled backward. Her reflection was there, staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. But just behind it, a tall, dark figure loomed, its form impossibly thin and its edges blurred, like smoke trapped behind glass. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. "You're gone. I left you there." The shadow tilted its head in the mirror, its movements slow and deliberate. Then, with horrifying clarity, it began to smile. Anna scrambled away from the mirror, her back hitting the wall. "You can't be here," she said, her voice rising. "I closed the door. I left you behind." The shadow didn't respond. It didn't need to. Its grin widened, splitting its face into something grotesque. And then it raised a hand, one long, skeletal finger pointing directly at Anna. Her breath caught in her throat as her own reflection began to move, independent of her. It stepped closer to the glass, mimicking the shadow's sinister smile. Anna shook her head violently. "No, this isn't real." Her reflection spoke, its voice a hollow echo of her own. "You brought me here, Anna. You let me in." Memories came rushing back. The glowing mirror, the pull of the shadow world, the figure's desperate warnings. What had she done? The shadow's voice resonated in her mind, overlapping with her reflections. "I told you, you cannot escape me. Wherever you go, I follow." Anna's reflection pressed its hands against the inside of the mirror, its eyes gleaming with malicious glee. The glass began to ripple like water, and she felt an invisible force pulling her forward. "No!" she screamed, clawing at the floor. But the pull grew stronger. The air in the room seemed to warp, the shadows closing in like a living entity. Her reflection leaned closer, its voice now a distorted whisper. "Don't fight it, Anna. You belong with me." Desperate, Anna's gaze darted around the room, searching for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on the bedside lamp. Without thinking, she lunged for it, yanking the cord from the wall. She turned back to the mirror, where her reflection and the shadow watched her with twisted amusement. "This ends now," she growled, raising the lamp above her head. Her reflection's smile faltered for the first time. "You can't destroy me," it hissed. "I am part of you now." Anna didn't hesitate. With all her strength, she brought the lamp crashing into the mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crack, fragments flying in every direction. A deafening roar erupted from the broken mirror, the shadow's form convulsing wildly as it was torn apart. Anna was thrown backward, hitting the floor hard. For a moment, everything was silent. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone. She sat up slowly, her eyes darting to the shattered mirror. The frame was empty, its surface now just jagged shards reflecting the dim light of her room. It was over, or so she thought. Anna let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. She'd done it. She destroyed the shadow, severed its hold on her. But as she stood, a chill ran down her spine. The shadows in her room hadn't disappeared. They lingered, darker and more menacing than ever. And then she saw it. In the largest shard of broken glass, her reflection stared back at her. It wasn't smiling anymore. It was screaming. Anna staggered away from the mirror, her heart racing. "No," she whispered. This isn't real. It's over. But the shadows began to move, creeping across the walls and floor, closing in around her. The scream from the shard grew louder, echoing in her mind, until it was joined by a familiar voice. "You can't escape me, Anna," the shadow whispered. "You never could." The darkness surged forward, swallowing the room in an instant. Anna's neighbors found her the next morning, her bedroom light still flickering. The mirror was shattered, the pieces scattered across the floor. But Anna was gone. All that remained was a single shadow, etched into the wall. It didn't belong to anyone, and it was smiling,